Okay, everyone. Greetings again, and apologies for the long delay between these video posts. Just got slammed with department assignments the last little bit. So I'm going to finish up the covering the material that we don't have in lecture video format for the first test, and so that will be Isocrates, Cicero with a dash of Quintilian, and St. Augustine. And I think the plan in here is to do, 3 separate videos. Maybe try to keep them in that 15-minute range if I can stay on track here. Whatever any other messages that I have, I'll just go ahead and send in an email to you so that I can just get straight to this. I have a couple of other follow-ups, but I'll deal with that online. So Isocrates is the person that we're going to be looking at to kick off our fourth and final model of rhetoric, right? So we've got the sophistic / Gorgianic model, the Platonic model, and the Aristotelian model. And this is our last one, the Isocratean / Ciceronian. Cicero is the most important popular figure in this tradition, but Isocrates is the most important sort of originator of these this approach to rhetoric, right? And so this takes us back to the Greek context. I guess we haven't left it yet. We are, contemporaries with like Aristotle at that time, right? So as rhetoric is ascendant in Athens as a form of practice and a form of study, Isocrates was a pretty successful teacher and theorizer of public life and so on. So as always, I'm just going to quickly go through the Rhetoric pages, and then we'll look at Against the Sophists and Antidosis, those two sort of shorter pieces by Isocrates where lots of key and relevant ideas about rhetoric and the model that he embodies are contained. And the way that we can think about Isocrates just sort of at the outset is I sort of pitch him as the kind of the best of the other models. And the way to think about him is this triangle with 3 parts that sort of all swirl together. We've got wisdom, which reminds us of the Platonic model, right? The search for truth. We've got eloquence, which reminds us of the sophistic model, right? Delivery, style, right? Sort of aesthetics, doing display, performance, and so on. So wisdom, eloquence, and the last one is virtue. I guess virtue kind of more goes with Platonic, and wisdom is like Aristotle, like practical wisdom. My apologies, right? So, Aristotle gives us the knowledge, the wise, knowledge of how to make a case. Plato gives us, of course, moral virtue, and then the sophists give us eloquence. That's neither here nor there, but it's just a handy way of thinking about, I think, the Isocratean approach, which is sort of like the surpluses of the others, kind of. So wisdom, virtue, eloquence, that's what matters. Wisdom, virtue, eloquence. And so that's why I say I think this is like the kind of the best of all the models, or the best of all the approaches, because we get all the kind of the best qualities, right? So being wise in one's attempts to persuade is really important. There's lots of ways of thinking about what that involves, right? But also being virtuous matters, right? Because we've seen with the Gorgianic model the power of this instrument of persuasion, that you can do all kinds of things, good, bad, otherwise, right? So the virtue kind of keeps you on course. And then the style part is important. You can't ignore it. We're talking about public pleading. We're talking about attempts to win people over. Eloquence is necessary, right? But it's tempered by wisdom and virtue. So these things really go together in an important, necessary way. We'll see that theme all throughout. So the pages in Rhetoric here on the 6th edition are 50 through 52, not much. This is going back into, I think, the 1st or 2nd chapter. We didn't deal with it at the time, but I wanted to sort of come back separately. So Isocrates, the teacher, it says here, at the very beginning, rhetoric was not principally a set of rules to guide speech-making, but a means of advancing a culture and propagating political ideas. So key thing to note with Isocrates and then Cicero and Quintilian after and so on, is that we're dealing with like practical affairs here, right? This is not high philosophizing like we saw with Plato, where he's not really interested in sort of figuring out the muddy affairs of political life and public life. This model is, right? But it's not just all about kind of power and getting in the muck and kind of pushing people around. That business of virtue is important, and it plays out in the way he talks about like character and the way he talks about like the good of Athenian culture and so on. All right, so advancing a culture is advancing a sort of political culture and like a national culture, right? And so the way you want to think about this model as well is that it actually has a kind of what I think of as a telos or a horizon that it's kind of aiming at, right? With Plato, the telos is like transcendent truth, right? Coming up with absolute knowledge. This is not that, but there is a telos, there's a purpose, there's a direction to which this model is aspiring, and it's some sense of kind of political unity, right? So the good of all is the goal here, and it's baked into the model, and that's important. Yeah, so his next paragraph, it says, we might see this rhetorical theory as social or political in nature, right? Which is, Aristotle's is not, the Gorgianic model is not, and the Platonic model is not, right? So this is a politically driven model, but think about it in terms of like civic virtue, right? Like, doing your best to serve your political community. And so that's why I say I think it's really the best model, because it's the one that's like on the ground, dealing with real worldly affairs, but is not just trying to manipulate and wield power. It's trying to make best possible cases using eloquence and wisdom and so on. So it's a civic rhetoric. Civic. That means think about like just sort of people coming together socially, dealing with matters in as high a way as possible in terms of like wisdom and virtue and so on. Next page 51, that second last paragraph raises this business of character. So it starts off, the practical, nationalistic, and moral education Isocrates offered to students was founded on natural talent, extensive practice, and the principles of rhetoric. So he was kind of realistic, I guess, with the possibilities of anyone becoming sort of the high ideal that he was seeking. Natural talent is important. I don't know if you've ever taken a public speaking class. I've taught a bunch of them, and unfortunately, there are students, fortunately or unfortunately, but there's students who are just sort of more predisposed to be able to kind of stand up in front of people and be comfortable and engaging. Others just struggle, right? Now you can move anyone from where they are to an improved place, but for him, it's like only a few that are kind of born with it. Like you're born to be a brilliant ice skater or something, But you can practice and you can get better. But natural talent certainly does matter. But then at the end he says, this concern for the orator's character sets Isocrates apart from the Sophists, whose rhetorical instruction was audience-centered. Character is about sort of ethos, right? It's sort of who you are and how you come across. And it matters that you're a good person striving for the good of the order, as my chair says. So you're sort of like a national educator. You're a teacher for the nation kind of idea as a civic rhetor in this way. So next page over, Isocrates and political theory. This is where he gets to that horizon idea that I mentioned. So after that quote, well, I'll read the quote here. It says, from Antidosis, we'll get back to this. There has been implanted in us the power to persuade each other and to make clear whatever we desire. Not only have we escaped the life of wild beasts, but we have come together and founded cities and made laws. Yeah, this is a very famous quote. The idea being that like the power of speech and eloquence is the very thing that's kind of elevated us out from a life of drudgery and sort of like braving the elements to sort of civilized order where we can come together as free citizens and engage and persuade and so on. So there's a high kind of moral, civic calling that he sees rhetoric having. So that's it for Herrick. Let's jump into Against the Sophists. There's, as I said, there are these two short pieces. Against the Sophists is him really just talking about, the duties of the educator, teaching this business of rhetoric, and he's taking aim at some of the other schools that were active at the time, mostly the Sophists, like Gorgias and so on, but also the philosophers, like Plato, and some of what he calls political teachers, or what is it? political speeches, those who promise to teach political speeches, like logographers. Lysias was one of these guys. And he's kind of got issues with the whole spectrum, right? So it's like, come study with me, where you're going to learn how to do like really, truly important work in rhetorical appeals, right? And learning how to be a citizen, a rhetorical citizen. So he's just kind of like going around and saying, you know, teachers who charge up front and then like don't deliver what they've promised are to be condemned. Teachers who only kind of obsess about like little philosophical questions are to be condemned. That's like Plato, right? On the second page, he says in the middle paragraph where the little number 9 next to it says, and not only is it right to level criticisms at these teachers, but also at those who promise political speeches. For they have no concern for the truth, and consider the skill to be that of bringing over as many as possible. At the end, he says, they promise to make their companions such orators that they overlook none of the possibilities of their subject, and they attribute none of this capacity either to the nature of the student. And he says a few more lines down, I would set a higher value than a good deal of property for philosophy to be capable of as much as they say it is. All right, so he's just kind of going after the different approaches. The next page, he talks about using fixed techniques. This is an important theme here, right? It's like if you come into an academy and you're just sort of learning one way of speaking, one way of pleading, like just follow this model. He says that's disastrous. So another important theme about Isocrates is, gets back to this concept of kairos, which I'm pretty sure we've talked about. Kairos, which is timeliness, right? That an opportune moment. The idea is like, you know, our social and civic lives are always kind of unfolding in a dynamic way, and so time is always of the essence, right? So when you say something and sort of catching the moment, like catching a wave, is like how you get up on a wave. I'm no surfer, but I know there's this moment where it's like catching it and getting up. That kind of idea of like catching the wave of the moment is really important, and it takes a certain kind of oratorical talent to be able to do that, right? It's like there's something that needs to be said. There's a situation. It's fleeting. The skilled orator will be able to kind of catch that wave and say the right thing at the right time. That's the idea of kairos, the right thing at the right time. I always think of the example of George W. Bush after the 9/11 attacks. There was like a day or two, or maybe just a day, where he was kind of like unaccounted for, and then he eventually went down to the rubble of the World Trade Center and was attempting to speak with the emergency workers down there, and they had been like toiling away, and they were just covered in filth, and they wanted to hear from their president. And now George W. Bush was not known as a masterful orator, but in this particular moment, he did something quite superb, rhetorically speaking, in terms of kairos. He had a bullhorn, and he was trying to talk to these emergency workers, firefighters, and like search and rescue, and medics, and so on. And he's speaking to them, and someone shouted out, "We can't hear you," right? Like it's too loud. And he tried again, and they said, "We can't hear you." And he shouted even louder, and he said, "But we can hear you. I can hear you. And whoever did this will hear from all of us soon enough," right? And it was just like, wow. It was exactly what those people kind of needed and received, which is like, thank you for your efforts. I hear you. I'm here for you. And I know you're struggling. I know you're angry. I know you're confused and frustrated. So soon enough, whoever did this is going to hear from all of us, right? And it was sort of like, wow. He just sort of said exactly what he needed to say. So that's a very Isocratean kind of idea, is that you have the ability in a moment to capture that moment and to say what needs to be said. That's very Isocratean. So he says a few more lines in this paragraph, the top one, in paragraph 12, it says, "For the words that have been spoken by someone else are not useful in the same way to the one who speaks after him. Rather, he seems to have the most technical skill who says something worth saying about a subject and is capable of discovering other things than all those discovered by the others." And toward the end he says, grasped and being fitting a novel. Fitting a novel is a great way of thinking about kairos, right? Saying the right thing that's fitting, but also novel in the sense that's kind of fresh, right? So George Bush saying, I hear you is fitting, but the novel part was the next, where's this going? And it's like, they're going to hear from all of us. And that's a little ominous, obviously. We know what happened after that. But again, it served that kind of rhetorical situation quite perfectly. So you get the fitting and the novel. And like I said, there's a kind of Isocratean virtue in the ability to use your imagination, your rhetorical imagination, to sort of capture that moment. Bottom of this page, paragraph 16 is pretty important. He says, I should like, now that I've gone this far along, to speak yet more clearly about these matters. This is like sort of his key moment. My claim is that to acquire the knowledge of the forms of speech out of which we compose all our speeches is not something very difficult if you entrust yourself not to those who promise it will be easy, but to those who know something about it. So don't trust these instructors who are just saying, come on in, I'll teach you 15 tricks and you'll be good to go. It's like, no. You have to learn the subject matter that you're speaking about. Political life, maybe you need to know about agriculture. Maybe you need to know about engineering. Who knows, right? But learning your subject, knowing your audience, and also having that horizon idea, like taking us somewhere important together. A few more lines down, and again, not to miss out on the opportunities, but to give the whole speech appropriate, elegant variation. So now we get into the eloquence part. So we got the virtue part, we got the knowledge part. Now here's the eloquence part. So it's not enough to just know and be able to kind of capture a moment. You also got to be able to use your creative imagination eloquently. And that's the part that really engages the audience, right? And say it is rhythmical and musical language. This is someone who cares about style, right? More so than Aristotle, who was kind of like more about reason and argumentation. And obviously Plato hates style, right? Gorgias is all about style. This is more like, no, you need it. It's important, but it can't cloud out wisdom and virtue, right? All this requires considerable training, hard work, and is the product of a manly and opinionated soul. So you have to have sort of that character thing, right? And it requires both that the student must have the necessary talent and learn the necessary forms of the speeches. So there's pretty much everything we need right in that one paragraph. And then a few more side swipes, and he's done. So that's a pretty good little look at his thoughts on education, civic education for civic purposes. Antidosis is even more kind of broad philosophical statement on rhetoric and its importance. So we'll just look at some of the key stuff here as well. How am I doing? 17. All right, make this quick. So we saw that quote in Rhetoric about the beasts and, speech sort of elevates us and civilizes us. That's at the beginning here. We find that in Cicero, too. We'll see this theme in Cicero. 4 paragraphs in, he talks about wisdom. He says, we shall find that none of the things which are done with intelligence take place without the help of speech, but that in all our actions as well in all our thoughts, speech is our guide and is most employed by those who have the most wisdom. Right? Learning, knowing your subject matter, not just learning tricks, but like real knowledge. Next page at the bottom paragraph. This is where he's going after like the Platonic metaphysical philosopher type school approach. He talks about philosophy as sort of being obsessed with, trivialities. He uses the phrase barren subtleties. I would therefore advise young men to spend some time on these disciplines, but not to allow their minds to be dried up by barren subtleties, these little tiny questions about we saw this in Plato, right? Like he obsesses over these little questions. Nor to be stranded on the speculations of ancient sophists who maintain, some of them, that the sum of things is made up of, okay. For I think that, a few more lines, I think that such curiosities of thought are on a par with jugglers' tricks. Not a lot of kind words for his fellow academicians. Let's see, next page over, that third paragraph, second full paragraph that begins my view of this question. I wrote in the column there, practical philosophy. So again, he cares about wisdom, he cares about learning, but for practical purposes, not just for this abstract sort of speculation about eternity, right? So he says, I hold that man to be wise who is able by his powers of conjecture to arrive generally at the best course. So using your knowledge and your insight to arrive at the best course. This feels a little bit like Aristotle, the best possible case, And I hold that man to be a philosopher who occupies himself with the studies from which he will most quickly gain that kind of insight. So, okay, go ahead and study philosophy, but only to the extent that it helps us here on the ground. He's not interested in up in the sky like Plato. Next, two more paragraphs that begins, "But I beg you." I have a fair bit underlined here, starting with, "I consider that the kind of art which can implant honesty and justice in depraved natures has never existed." Okay, so this is getting into the question of, can virtue be taught? Right? Like this whole thing about like, well, how do we get virtue and eloquence kind of together? How do you teach these things together? Because usually if we're teaching like eloquence, it's all about winning people over, and you kind of set virtue aside. So how do you sort of bring these together? He says, "I do hold that people can become better and worthier if they conceive an ambition to speak well." This is interesting. It's sort of like two roads that if you pursue them simultaneously, they'll eventually converge, right? The road of wisdom and the road of eloquence, if you pursue them earnestly, then they'll start to just kind of become one same road, right? If they conceive an ambition to speak well, if they become possessed of the desire to be able to persuade their hearers, and finally, if they set their hearts on seizing their advantage. I do not mean advantage in the sense given to that word by the empty-minded, but advantage in the true meaning of that term. So he says at the very end, or actually the next paragraph at the end, it says, "Those which are great and honorable, devoted to the welfare of man and our common good." That idea of common good goes by the name Pan-Hellenism back then. So Isocrates was all about sort of unifying Greek culture, all these Greek city-states, right? Like we want one culture. That's the goal, to all of our speeches and all of our civic efforts to kind of promote the idea of Greek unity. That's the horizon. So next, very bottom of the page there, "He will select from all the actions of men which bear upon his subject those examples which are the most illustrious and the most edifying." Next page, the end of that paragraph. "It follows that the power to speak well and think right will reward the man who approaches the art of discourse with love of wisdom and honor." So again, the triangle, honor, like virtue, wisdom, eloquence, they all sort of flow into one another. We get character in the next paragraph. We get honor again, right? So he's all about this. "Therefore, the stronger a man's desire to persuade his hearer, the more zealously he will strive to be honorable and to have the esteem of his fellow citizens." Sounds nice. Is it true? Maybe we see it sometimes, but I think we know very well that like just the pursuit of eloquence is often its own kind of reward in terms of public's appeal and popularity. So, but nevertheless, this model is, I just think of this as the Obama model. Remember, Obama, before he was president, was a community organizer. This is someone who was out in the community doing everything in his power to help people, right, for the common good, virtue. And he also happened to be, very, very eloquent. And he was also a constitutional scholar, so he knew a lot of stuff, right? So, and he also talked about American unity, right? He said there's not just red states and blue states, there's America, right? And that was sort of his Isocrateanism, his attempt to try to bring all states together. And there you go. So I think the themes are pretty clear, to be honest, in these readings. Like, once you know kind of what he's up to, it's like it's all right there. So in my class, when we taught this in class, we had a conversation about like, the virtue part, when his whole business of Pan-Hellenism is like the promotion of Greek unity. And I asked my class, like, is that virtue or is that something else? Because another way of talking about that could be like imperialism, right? It's like enforcing your cultural values on others. And some students very cleverly said, well, it's good if you're Greek. If you're not Greek, maybe not so much, right? But in any case, there's a horizon, like a political horizon to the Isocratean model that aspires for the common good of the polis. And we don't see that in quite that kind of well-defined a way in any of the other models. So I personally think this is like the kind of ultimate model. And it's certainly the one that we'll see next through Cicero. And I've mentioned before, I think, but, worth repeating that Cicero remains the most known rhetorician of all time, both as a theorist and a practitioner. And so the fact that the Ciceronian model is Isocratean is important because, Cicero is the man in terms of rhetorical theory and history. So we'll be turning to Cicero next, just to kind of look at some of his distinctions and, just kind of cover some of the big themes there. And I'll see you in the next video.